Working for the SCP Foundation can be a frightening endeavor, but not all the anomalies they encounter are violent, vicious monsters all intent on destruction. SCPs can often be as lost, lonely, and sad as the rest of us sometimes feel. In that spirit, let's take a heartbreaking and tear-jerking journey through some of the saddest SCPs that might even make you cry. Get those tissues ready, and don't say we didn't warn you. To the untrained observer, SCP-348 is just an ordinary white bowl with blue flower patterns painted on its ceramic surface. The Chinese lettering on its side translates to the phrase, "thinking of you." However, if anyone suffering from a minor injury, like a scraped knee, a cut, or a bruise, or any other mild ailment is presented with the bowl, its anomalous properties will begin to show. SCP-348 will fill itself with soup, usually varying in ingredients, but consistently enjoyed by those that have eaten from it. Finishing the soup, though, that's what can start the waterworks. After someone consumes the contents of SCP-348, a message will appear within the bowl, seemingly coming from the subject's own father. In one such instance, a young boy of 6 who had been recently injured whilst playing with his friends was given SCP-348 to eat from. The boy's parents were divorced, and his father no longer lived at home. When the child ate the soup, the message in the bowl read, "I'm sorry, son." Another similar test was run by the Foundation using SCP-348, this time with an older boy of 11 years old who was suffering from a cold. He had also been adopted by a foster family prior, and the message that appeared after he'd eaten it said, "I'm glad you're happy." When testing the effects of SCP-348 on adults, less of them felt inclined to finish the soup in the bowl. One of these much older subjects, a 43-year-old woman with a sore throat, had become estranged from her parents after moving away from home. However, she would frequently send them money and eventually help arrange senior housing for her parents until her father passed away. While she initially remarked that her soup tasted bitter, it was fulfilling by the end of the meal. The note left by SCP-348 simply said, "Thank you." Once a test was conducted involving SCP-348 and a 60-year-old man who was suffering from a terminal illness. The grandfather to many grandchildren was offered the bowl of soup and delightedly ate it, claiming it was the best soup he had ever tasted. It gave him a sense of satisfaction and even eased some of the pain caused by his illness. A week later, the old man passed away peacefully in his sleep. Oh, what's that? Those sweet soup messages weren't wholesome enough to encourage even a few sobs? Okay then, you heartless little monster. We'll step up our game with SCP-3017. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking that this is a particularly monstrous SCP. After all, that is his anomalous effect. Fraser Melbrook is, or rather was, an otherwise ordinary man afflicted with an infectious cognitohazard. This would alter the perception of anyone around Fraser or any person who might have spoken to him, and made them believe that he belonged in custody. People would be compelled to think that Fraser was a dangerous, violent individual, but with no actual proof that he was. In many cases, anyone exposed to his cognitohazard would even try to lock him up themselves. The one reprieve, however, was that a number of Fraser's immediate family and close friends were immune to this effect. Either this was through experiencing prolonged exposure to SCP-3017, or by simply knowing him well enough to have context that canceled out the false beliefs that he was a violent criminal with an extensive record. Designated as SCP-3017-1s, the people closest to him remain unaffected, and Fraser was able to maintain healthy relationships with all of them, until SCP-3017 fell into the hands of the Foundation. Arrested and placed in containment thanks to the anomalous effects of SCP-3017, the Foundation believed that Fraser Melbrook had close ties and connections to multiple groups of interest. They began to relentlessly, torturously interrogate Fraser, threatening his family unless he gave them the answers to their questions, information that he simply could not provide. He hadn't even heard of the GOIs the Foundation wanted to know about, let alone had any direct affiliation with them. But still, they kept pressing him, keeping him locked up and not allowing him to see his family, even when his grandmother developed lung cancer. Treated with suspicion and hostility non-stop every day, SCP-3017 would get one last shot at freedom, however. Researcher Rylan, who had been studying Fraser's anomalous properties, as well as a security officer that had been assigned to watch Melbrook, both developed the same immunity to the prisoner's cognitohazard as his family and friends had. Working together, they were able to spring SCP-3017 from Foundation custody, and Ryland took him back home to see his family. Little did either of them know of the tragedy that awaited them. In a cruel twist of fate, a house fire had set Melbrook's family home ablaze, claiming the lives of his parents, both brothers, his sister, grandmother, and even his fiancée. Utterly devastated and overwhelmed with grief, the loss of his loved ones completely broke Fraser. He had spent so much of his life persecuted, accused of heinous crimes and arrested despite being completely innocent. And as if that wasn't bad enough, he'd fought his way free from the Foundation, only to find his home reduced to ash the day before he made it back. By the time the SCP Foundation arrived to recapture him, it was already too late. Fraser was dead, and researcher Ryland turned herself over without resistance. The Foundation soon realized what they had done, how they had tortured an innocent man who didn't actually have the information they thought he did. In quiet shame, they reclassified SCP-3017 under a new object class, Neutralized. Feeling teary yet? Maybe a little moist around the eyes? Oh, those are just your allergies. Oh yeah, of course they are. How could we be so silly? Alright, let's move on. Taking a step back from grim dark reality for a moment, let's instead delve into a world of fantasy. SCP-1762 was a seemingly ordinary cardboard box, spray-painted silver with the words, "Here be dragons," written on it in permanent marker. Usually it remained empty, but would occasionally open, releasing dozens of tiny origami dragons that would fly out after black smoke had plumed out of the box. It was no doubt a sight to behold, the kind of fantastical occurrence that is inherently filled with childlike wonder. Often, a written or carved message would be left behind after the origami dragons flew back into their box, and this is how the Foundation was able to learn of the terrible misfortune known as the Jabberwocky event. The paper dragons existed in a world of fantasy, all contained within the cardboard box. When they first emerged, the message they left greeted someone who had seemingly created the box and its fantastical contents, or had at least interacted with it before, possibly a particularly imaginative child with the reality-bending capability to give life to the inanimate paper dragons. The origami creatures seemed to mistake the Foundation for this original child, rediscovering them after an extended period of time. They made mention of the existence of other mystical beings in their world, including giants, elves, centaurs, and more. Through their subsequent messages, it appeared something about the world of SCP-1762 was gradually becoming unstable, though. It required imagination to sustain it, to stabilize the fantasy within the box. But unfortunately, the Foundation personnel examining SCP-1762 refused to accept the existence of this world. They instead leaned on science, cold, hard facts, not the whimsy of the imaginary. When opening the box, all they saw was its empty interior, so to them, the fantasy wasn't real. It was the SCP Foundation's own lack of belief, their refusal to make believe, that was gradually killing the world inside SCP-1762. Through their notes, still unaware that they weren't speaking with their child creator, the origami dragons pleaded for aid, cries that fell on the Foundation's deaf ears. Within the box, a magical war broke out between the various creatures inside, with the survivors fleeing for their lives. The box itself was effectively a portal, linking reality with this realm of fantasy. It existed in a time when the myths and legends of old were indeterminable from fact. SCP-1762 had once represented a physical bond, a relationship between those two worlds. But as time had moved on, belief in legends, in fantasy, had all but dwindled. As the world inside the box fell into chaos, becoming more and more unstable, the words, "Here be dragons," were burned away from the cardboard surface. In their final message, the dragons mentioned they hoped to escape to a new world, concluding with, "We are sad. We love you. We will not forget you. We are scared. Will you forget us?" Soon after, the box returned to its original state, with the phrase, "Here were dragons," on the side, marking the end of the Jabberwocky event, and potentially the fantasy within SCP-1762 forever. From mystical, magical tales of sadness, we now turn to a sad story from within the ranks of the Foundation itself. SCP-451, formerly a field agent working in the Foundation, seems to an outside observer to be little more than an average man in his 30s. Well, as average as someone working for the Foundation can be. But let's turn things around. If we weren't to look from SCP-451's perspective, how would he see us? That's just the thing. He wouldn't. He can't see us, or anyone else for that matter. You see, for a time, this agent was declared missing in action by the SCP Foundation. The last recorded assignment he was sent on was an attempt to retrieve a dangerous anomalous artifact. However, this attempt ultimately failed, and SCP-451 resurfaced a month later at Site-19. Although, from his point of view, the entire Foundation facility was empty. He was the last man on Earth, or so he thought, at least. Some unknown influence had permanently altered the agent's perception. He had been rendered incapable of perceiving other human beings. Now, if you're a bit of a hermit who prefers their own company, then this might initially sound like heaven, never having to experience another awkward interaction with another person, like when you're walking down the street and someone walking towards you, and you have to try to figure out which way they're going so you can step in the opposite direction and avoid bumping into them. Then you inevitably do that weird shuffle when you both go to walk the same way. You know, it's a whole thing. Well, as good as that might sound to be rid of happenings like that, imagine if you couldn't see or hear anyone. Any attempts the rest of the world made to communicate with you, not one of them registering. But it was somehow worse than that. Thanks to his newfound surroundings or lack thereof, SCP-451 believed that by interacting with the anomalous artifact, he had single-handedly wiped out the entire human race. The guilt of that action, although only true from his perspective, weighed heavily on SCP-451's conscience. He spent a lot of time wandering the corridors of Site-19, overwhelmed by his apparent isolation. Eventually, the loneliness of his newfound condition, coupled with the fallacious knowledge that he had killed the entire human race, drove him to a state of near madness. But there would be no escape from this new state of perpetual hell. Not only did the condition appear to be incurable, at least from what he was capable of doing, but he would not even find solace in death. He had been cursed with some kind of sadistic immortality, and it seemed like the only way to ever connect with others was when they themselves were near death. As for what the Foundation were doing to help SCP-451, well, nothing. There's little that can do to reverse the change. He was a valuable field agent to them before it happened, and it's their hope that he can be again if the process is somehow reversed. Until then, SCP-451 is forced to live out this painful existence, spending every day, as far as he can tell, alone. Of course, if SCP-451 could wish for anything in his predicament, it might be something as simple as some company. If only there was an SCP that granted the user their ultimate wish, fulfilled any fantasy, made them the hero of their own story. Well, that happens to be the function of SCP-1230. It appears as a green hardcover book with no discernible labels on the spine, nor on either front or back covers. The pages are almost entirely blank, save for one simple phrase on the first one: "A hero is born." Anyone that reads the pages of SCP-1230 won't experience any effects immediately. In fact, its anomalous properties don't become apparent until the reader falls asleep. When they do, they will experience a vivid dream that can last anywhere from 45 seconds to, well, let's just say considerably longer. Although the reader will never be asleep for any longer than they normally would be, in their dream, the reader will be the protagonist within their own fantasy world. The entire time they remain fully aware of their surroundings. Their senses and faculties all work as they would as if they were awake. Not unlike the fantasy world of SCP-1762, the dream worlds experienced by test subjects who read SCP-1230 vary differently on the imagination of the dreamer. Additionally, once they re-emerge from their slumber, they will be able to recall all the events of the dream down to every last detail. Every dream induced by reading SCP-1230 will also feature a character known only as the Bookkeeper, a friendly bearded old man in a green cloak who is apparently the personification of the book itself. The role of the Bookkeeper seems to create the fantasyscapes, as he calls them, and seemingly creates these bespoke worlds on behalf of all the dreamers he encounters, in accordance with their own deepest desires and wants. By now, you're no doubt thinking, how could this possibly be a sad SCP? I bet you probably even want to go with SCP-1230 yourself, don't you? And who wouldn't? After all, you would get to be placed in a fantasy scape where you can do anything and everything you can think of. On top of that, this isn't Inception. Dying or being harmed in one of these dreams doesn't translate to real-world death. Well, not directly anyway. Remember when we mentioned that dreams can last a considerably long time, at least in their own internal fantasy-scape time? Well, here's what makes it one of the saddest SCPs on this list, maybe even ever. Imagine getting to live out a fantasy adventure as the hero, the main protagonist in your own story. Picture you spent a number of years in that dream time, experiencing every event of that story, that world firsthand. It looks real, it feels real, for the time that you're there at least. So what happens when you wake up? How are you going to feel if you're all of a sudden pulled out of that fantasy and dropped back into the mundanity of real life? Would you prefer your fantasy to the real world? And what would you do if you couldn't go back? That was experienced firsthand by one of the Foundation's researchers, known only as Professor B. He had specifically requested the Foundation to allow him to read SCP-1230, and was giddy with excitement when it came to be his turn. Like many others, he read the first page, seeing a hero is born, and then instantly went to sleep, unwilling to wait until later, clearly eager to experience his very own fantasy-scape. Professor B was asleep for the next 24 hours before the Foundation's security personnel were forced to attempt to wake him up. When he did, he looked around, confused to be unceremoniously returned to real life. It was almost as if the amount of time he had spent within the bookkeeper's dream world had caused him to momentarily forget his old life with the Foundation. However, he soon regained his memory after a brief reminder from fellow staff, but it was never the same after that. Professor B had experienced the life he had always dreamed of within his dreams, and upon waking, he had been returned to a life where he was an aging, tired man in a dead-end job at the Foundation. He was no hero here. He was just another nobody. And the sadness was too much for him. Professor B passed away not long after. After this tragedy, the bookkeeper was utterly distraught. Through the medium of the book, he left a note for the personnel of the SCP Foundation. It read, "I'm so sorry. I never intended for this to happen. I just wanted to make people happy." A number of weeks passed before the Foundation was able to make contact with the bookkeeper again, leaving a note that requested a conversation with the entity. A Foundation doctor experienced a dream that was set in a dark, featureless void. There he encountered the bookkeeper, crying to himself. When questioned about what had happened to Professor B, the embodiment of SCP-1230 explained, "He had such an active imagination. I was able to create a vast and beautiful universe for him, and it was obvious that he wanted a life like that for so long. He conquered foul beasts and rescued princesses. He built kingdoms and even raised a family, but he never wanted to leave. He delved so far into his fantasy world that I soon realized he preferred his dream over the real world. I reminded him that this was all merely an illusion, but he wouldn't listen to me. I tried to keep him happy for as long as I could." Remember when we mentioned the dreams can last a considerably long time, at least in their own internal fantasy-scape time? Professor B had been living out his ultimate fantasy adventure for 200 years, while only a full day's worth of time had passed in the real world. Having to live through all that, only to wake up and realize none of it was real, was perhaps too existentially overwhelming for the professor. Then again, maybe he just preferred the world of his fantasy-scape much more than the world around him. That brings us to one of the most infamous anomalies in the Foundation's extensive history. SCP-096, better known as the Shy Guy, is a terrifying, towering creature with a hairless body, sunken eyes, and a huge, gaping mouth. But don't you ever get the sense that there's something inherently sad about SCP-096? Insecurity is something a lot of us experience and have to face every day. But the Shy Guy's is taken to such an extreme degree, he can't bear the thought of anyone looking at him. It's so bad for him that it causes him to experience so much distress that he has to travel lightning fast to anyone that looks at his face, and once he's caught up with them and killed them, then he's right back to his usual routine, sobbing and weeping or pacing around his cell. Perhaps his story isn't as sad as some of the others on this list, but we do know it'd be a welcome change if someone could make the Shy Guy smile, just for a little while. Now go check out 25 Most Frightening SCPs, and what is the scariest SCP? if you'd like to replace that sadness with some good old-fashioned fear.